Welcome to From Rome Info Video. My name is Brother Alexis Buñuel. I'm the publisher and editor of FromRome.info, an electronic journal for news commentary about Rome, the Vatican, and Italy. Today I published the documentary produced by DW entitled The Rise and Fall of Joseph Ratzinger. And since I chose as editor to publish it, having just watched the whole thing, I think I'm obliged to make a video and respond. Now, visually, just from the cinematography, it's a very well-made video. Ideologically, though, it is heavily laden with a lot of content that needs to be responded to. I would say it's very artfully crafted, and DW is a known calumniator of Pope Benedict. So I don't think that one can accept on face value the narrative. And I think there's many inaccuracies in things that are not accurate. Well, not authentically representing historical record. But rather than get into all those little details, I think I want to address the more major issues. The first of all is that personal responsibility. So here we have, in the modern world, two rival and irreconcilable concepts of personal responsibility. There's the Catholic concept that individuals are responsible, and there is the Masonic concept that individuals are not responsible, institutions are responsible. And the Masons have this doctrine because they want to break down institutions and raise a satanic society where institutions are no longer responsible and neither are you, and that anything whatsoever can be done in the name of justice or love. And there's really no reason behind their theory. It's extremely destructive and everything would break down. They hate words like justice. They hate words like hierarchy. They hate words like order. These are inimical to them, right, wrong, and morality, conscience. And they certainly don't believe in Jesus Christ and his gospel. And that view just oozes out of this video, this so-called documentary, on every minute. I mean, it's just like gushing with it. You can't, it's like it reeks of it. And they never at all say that the perp is responsible. So first I want to address that theory of responsibility, that only institutions are responsible, not persons. Let's take an example of police. So in a police department in Ireland, if a policeman rapes a child, does that mean all the police in the department are guilty? All the police in Ireland are guilty? Does that mean the institution of the civilian police around the world should be abolished, totally reorganized, and fundamentally restructured? This is what is proposed. The United States, there's been a big movement to defund the police because of alleged racism of police departments. But when you hear their proposal, what is their solution? Their solution is legitimizing pedophilia, lowering the age of consent, so that basically all the crimes that they're opposed to would no longer be crimes. So then you could have a truly Masonic police force in which there's no longer any child abuse because it's all legitimate. It's just an expression of love. So it's just patently deceitful and the most knavish kind of just chancery and trickery to suggest that because of the faults of some policemen, the entire institution should be so fundamentally changed that when it becomes a completely satanic and Masonic institution, there's no longer any sin, and you can't complain about it. You have to get raped as many times as we want you to be raped, and your children too. So I don't think you need to even build a logical argument to that. It's just so obviously evil. And anyone who says that the church is trying to defend its corrupt institution by opposing that proposal is just an absolute asinine liar. And a patent one. It's just patently manifest. The church's view in her teaching of her saints, doctors, fathers of the church, and in Scripture, is that the individual is responsible. However, other individuals can be responsible if they collaborate in the commission of the crime or they consent to it. There's 5 ways of participating in the crime of another. You assent to it, saying intellectually it's not a crime. You consent to it, where you allow it to happen, knowing that it is going to happen. That could be before or after the fact. After the fact is called toleration. You contribute to it in some way. You know the person's going to probably commit a crime or sin. You provide them the place, the money, the means, the method. And this is often a sin of parents in regarding to sinful children. You publicly defend it, or you excuse it. And we see all those in regard to the Russian war and the Russian aggression against Ukraine. People are actually just excusing it and making and saying it's okay, or condoning it one way or the other. So while it is true that priests and religious who rape, or even church employees who sexually abused children or adults, men or women, are ultimately responsible, and they alone, the members of the church's institutions who knew about it or collaborated in one of these 5 ways are also responsible. And the church does need to discipline not only the perpetrator himself, but the whole gang around him, and the whole way in which that the system around him that enabled him or condoned him or hid him or protected him protected itself and kept itself alive. And this can't be denied. I'm a strong opponent of sexual abuse by clergy and religious. I have blown whistles on them at least 3 cases, and gotten perps investigations open, and perps in one way punished the other in both sides of the Atlantic. And some groups hate me for that, and I think more groups than you can imagine hate me for that. But I'm proud. I'm glad. But I know there's a problem in the church. I know it's a deep problem in the church. That's why when I saw the level of psychological abuse in my former community, I left and I never joined another community. I don't sleep in rectories. I almost never sleep in monasteries because I know the problem is so pervasive, but I haven't lost faith in my Lord and Savior. I just recognize there's a difference between corruption and the institution. So here we make the distinction between something that was not made in this video. This video wants you to doubt, and even ends with like, modern men should reject the whole religion of Christ because it's an institution run by pedophiles or pedophile protectors. Where it's actually the Masons who are institution of pedophiles and pedophile protectors, and they're just trying to take over control because the church fights them too much on it. One of the issues raised so that's on personal responsibility, and I think we all agree that the church does need some sort of institution to make sure that corruption doesn't spread and conspiracies of corruption doesn't spread. And the church had such an institution. It was called the Holy Office. And before Vatican II, there were historic cases in which sexual abuse happened and was not properly addressed. In ages before there was any kind of modern study of these affairs. But as far as we know, there are far less cases, and a greater morality prevailed. So how does the church defend herself against this kind of corruption? Well, first of all, you have to understand that the Catholic Church, that means that the priesthood, the hierarchy, and religious, is prone to infiltration by sexual perverts of this kind. Why? Because it's a climate in which they can operate. Now, just to cite the crudest for an example, A man who becomes a priest because he wants to rape boys is not going to ask the bishop to assign him to be a chaplain of a convent full of women, because there's no boys he can get to next to it in that position. And men who want to have sex with men just think it's wonderful going into a monastery where there's only men, because they're sexually attracted to men. It's like, if you were a heterosexual man, you were invited to work in a studio of female models. Okay. Men would just line up for that kind of a job. So institutions like an all-male priesthood, or even an all-male police, or all-male military, or all-male firemen, these institutions, just naturally speaking, are prone to be infiltrated because they attract men of that perversion. Religious institutes that run schools with children are more prone to be infiltrated by pedophiles than institutions that have nothing to do with the training of the children. Now, I love history, church history, and I've read a lot of church history. And one of the things that I came to know of in my studies is that before the Black Death, church institutions had almost nothing to do with the training of children. About the only time the church came in contact with children was at the parish, where the children were taught the faith. It was usually in the presence of other adults, or in the so-called cathedral schools where they taught Latin or some small amounts of courses. But with the Black Death having wiped out most of the adult clergy in the church, they had to rush whole numbers of young men into the priesthood without any kind of formation, whether they had vocations or not. And so by the next century, we see massive amounts of corruption in the church, and it became intolerable in some societies, or at least there was the condition of people becoming totally incapable of supporting it anymore, and the Reformation exploited that discontent in the countries where the corruption was really the worst. And whole generations of Catholics in Northern Europe lost the faith and never came back, and that started the decline of Western civilization. And this was a problem too big for anyone of the age to comprehend it, because there was no one studying these things. So human beings understand things the more we experience them and study them. And the one good thing about the empirical method is that by constantly looking at cases, we can learn something we wouldn't normally know. If you've studied the feathers of 1,000 kinds of birds, you know more than the person who's only looked at the feathers of the chickens in his backyard, for example. And one method of learning about deviant human behaviors is called the clinical method, and that's where you actually speak with people who suffer from behavioral disorders, lots of them, and you begin to see patterns. And a modern clinical analysis of human behavior is only something in the last century so at most, in a really scientific point of view. So we can't really fault the church or even the clergy because they did not know that the way they were dealing with the problem was only making it worse, was not a solution. We cannot, that would be require men to act on knowledge they couldn't possibly have. How many of us knew anything about this before it was in the newspapers? A small note to this video is DW tries to make the Boston Globe look, wonderful, exposing the corruption. But I'm from that part of the world. The reporters of the Boston Globe knew this was going on for 25 years and sat on it like everyone else sat on it. So they weren't lily clean. And they published that whole thing to make themselves lily clean. And that was their first reason. The second reason is because the cardinal was opposed to gay marriage. So they figured they're going to take the church down so they could get gay marriage. And they did get gay marriage after that. So you have almost everyone who's using the so-called sex abuse crisis in the church for some political end. It's to destroy Christianity and advance the Masonic immoral agenda. And it's not because they care for the victims. They don't give a bleep about the victims. They want the victims to have lots of money, then they sell them drugs, and then committing suicide, they swindle them. The statistics in the United States show that almost all the victims who got large sums of money destroyed themselves with it. There's like a third of them committed suicide. And another third became drug addicts or alcoholics or manic depressives. It's really a sad, tragic thing. Now, I actually have, on one occasion, met a man who was sexually abused by the clergy in the town where I lived in Massachusetts, and it happened like 25 years before I met the man, about 10 years before I even moved to town, 20 years before I ever moved to town. So it was not anyone I knew of, and so I could talk to him very frankly about it. And I'm being trained in anthropology is a science where you talk to people and learn about things. So it's a real tragedy to see how much these people are scarred and how much they're damaged by it. And the one thing I like about in this film is that one of the victims, a female victim, says, "Why did the bishop get upset about the priest giving me communion and not get upset so much that I was raped?" And the way she said it isn't exactly correct, but what she's saying is true. So in Catholic moral teaching, all deviations from the moral order should equally offend us. We shouldn't be offended more by one kind of mortal sin than another, because if it is a mortal sin, it violates the will of God, and that should be the reason why we should be upset by a sin, and not just other sins, but our own. And we should acquire such a disgust for even the slightest moral deviation that we don't even commit venial sins. And it's becoming increasingly difficult because the Masons are doing everything to promote strife in society and even turn Catholics against Catholics. And social media just trains people to attack one another. So it's a very vicious platform, and it sometimes can be very discouraging if you even get involved in it, because people come on to attack you, not to read anything you're saying or hear your videos or try to be edified, even if you're trying to be edifying. But she does say a good thing. And so this is a reform we need in the church. The clergy should be just as offended that a person is sexually abused than as a sacrament is violated. So if there's one big truth in this video, among all the lies, misinformations, and bad will to manipulate this crisis in the church, it's that the reforms of Vatican II have failed. Precisely the kind of reforms that Cardinal Ratzinger was pushing, that Joseph Ratzinger was pushing, failed to produce a church of holiness. And he had to drink the bitter cup of that reality in his first years of his papacy. So much so that the film makes a good argument that he might be quite depressed about what has happened and quite disappointed. But it omits that he might realize just how corrupt it is, and that he's trying to protect the church from these monsters in the hierarchy. That it hides. It hides the whole thing about his renunciation. It is true what Ganswein says, you can't resign, because resignation is you renounce the ministry rather than the munus, which isn't exactly correct, but you shouldn't do it unless you have some divine inspiration. It ignores all the other things. It ignores all the other evidence, because they're trying to make him look bad. They're trying to make him look like he was destroyed, he was a fake, and he was a deceiver. There are some good points and some good criticisms that make. No one should be so loyal to the Pope that they hide clerical abuse. I don't care if you are the head of the Holy Office. And this is something tremendously wrong in the church. While it is true that we should not divulge information about others that no one knows, that would damage their reputations, when we have information that other people are gravely violating the rights of others, and that they're in an imminent situation where this can be repeated, and we know of it, even the highest authority on earth cannot keep us quiet about it. We have no obligation to keep quiet about that. Because to protect one child from rape is more important than an illicit command from your superior to keep quiet about it. And if John Paul II was telling Cardinal Ratzinger to keep quiet about Maciel, he cannot be a saint of God. It's just impossible. And maybe John Paul was just so naive that he felt this man was being wrongly accused. But nevertheless, if Ratzinger knows or knew that that's not the case, he had no duty to obey him. And maybe he had a badly formed conscience. I'm not the judge of his interior form as a cardinal. But that is something that should not be tolerated, because why? the natural right of self-defense against being raped by anyone, even a priest, is far more important than a merely positive obligation imposed on you by a superior who doesn't have the authority to impose it under that extreme case. So it is true that if you're serving a Holy Father, if he asks you to keep a secret, you're obliged to keep it, but not under an absolute obligation. You can't keep it if that endangers other people. And if you know someone is a mass murderer or a mass rapist or a pedophile, abuser, you have to tell the Holy Father if he asks you, Your Holiness, you have no right to ask me, because the defense of the mystical body and the right to defense is something that God has given us, our Creator and our Savior. And you cannot limit me, because my duty to Christ to defend the mystical body is greater than my duty to obey you in being silent about this matter. And that would be the proper response anyone in the Curia should say to the Roman Pontiff about such a secret. And if you don't know that, then your conscience is deformed by clericalism. And there's a lot of that in the church. And Bergoglio is only making it worse. But I don't mean to say that Ratzinger sinned, because I don't know this formation of his conscience. And I would imagine that this kind of clarity is just not in priestly formations, never been in priestly formation. You would have to have studied very well Aristotle, Plato, and the scholastics and know how to make distinctions. And Ratzinger is not a scholastic when it comes to these things, nor is he an expert in moral theology. Nor does he have any training in forensics. I don't think he's even one who has read books on forensic or criminal investigations. So I don't mean to imply any judgment on that. But it is clear that if you hear about all these cases of abuse and they come closer to home, it can be disappointing. Now, as far as the report about abuse in the boys' choir run by the Holy Father's brother, I don't take that for granted, because as far as I remember the reports, they first came out and claimed there was like hundreds of cases of abuse, but when you looked at the details, there was no sexual abuse. It was all physical abuse, and physical abuse is nothing more than slapping the boys when they weren't paying attention, or faulting them with a stick on their hand if they got something wrong, which was considered standard discipline in German schools of the era. And it wasn't like there was rape going on while they were singing boys. Now, I think one of the priests involved in forming the boys to sing, not the Holy Father's brother, did on other properties at other times sexually abuse boys, but you can't really say that that was part of the choir, although he preyed on the members of the choir, or that you can't even build a case that the choir director would have known about it, since it didn't take place on the grounds and none of the boys told him about it. Assuming none of the boys told him about it. And that might be very the case, because German society is very formal. And in cases of child abuse, many of the children don't ever talk about it. And many of the victims probably still haven't yet come forward. So that they would talk to the choir master about it is very unlikely. And so to try to use that to paint something on the Holy Father is just ridiculous. But DW did that with the report that came out in January that was engineered by Karl Marx to move the blame of him running the diocese onto the rival of his Vatican ally, Jorge Bergoglio. So I think I covered most of the topics in that video, and why it is so manipulative. Is extremely manipulative video, and I can understand why some of my readers might object that I published it. But I think it should be discussed, and I'm not one for hiding this kind of controversy. I think it's important, because there still needs a lot to be done to protect children, and the Catholic priesthood and the hierarchy especially needs still a big moral reform. And I think, and this not only means going back to the traditional morality of the church, which has been ignored for a century. It's all written down in St. Alphonsus. But even in St. Alphonsus' moral theology, when you come to the questions of mortal sins that men can commit, it is so vaguely written that I think even the best students of St. Alphonsus in Latin wouldn't understand what he's talking about. And this needs to be more clearly taught in seminaries and in formation, because most men don't know how to keep themselves chaste and end up doing all sorts of things because they don't even know how their own bodies function. So, and priests more than anyone else, if they're going to promise perpetual celibacy, and monks, if they're going to promise perpetual chastity, they should at least be taught how to control themselves. Because if they have goodwill, that doesn't mean they necessarily know how to do it. Okay, that requires some knowledge, and that kind of information is well known. And by control themselves, I mean how to resist temptation, and what is sexual temptation really at the psychological, chemical level. How does it occur? How does it rise? How to resist it? And what is it all about? And once you understand it on the biological level, it's very easy to overcome temptations, because then with your reason, you can immediately see you not be deceived into making the immoral decisions to consent to impurity outside of marriage act. And that is something that needs yet to be done in the church, and hasn't. But the big problem is that we now have so much infiltration in the church and so much moral perversion that people are confusing the criminal element with the institution. And there needs to be a separation of that. And what Benedict did in 2013, on February 11th, is helping the church see that. Hopefully people see the difference between the criminal element and the church. And the criminal element wants a new religion, and the Catholic believing element wants the faith that's always been. And so it's becoming clear, if people want to see it, what that is. Could Benedict have done more? We can't judge the man. Everyone is within his own abilities, and limited. We are all limited, especially by our experience and expectations. And it may be true what this video depicts, that he was just blindsided by the level of corruption. And but one final thing I wish to add is, I think, if I had an hour with the Holy Father, I'd say, Holy Father, if you're blindsided by it, it's because you don't yet understand the intimate relationship between the adoration of God and sexual morality. You have to, as a priest or religious, decide to adore God with your whole being, mind, heart, soul, and flesh, and not just love him. And there's been so much talk in the last 4 centuries in Catholic spirituality in the West about loving God. Adore him, because the definition of love can be perverted, distorted, and misapplied. It's adore him. Get your egotistic desire to be loved out of the picture. It's adore God. He is your creator. That comes first, before any desire to get recompense. And unless we get back on this track of true spirituality, the church is not going to recover. It's just going to fall into a sentimental abyss. And the Holy Father, during his first 8 years of his pontificate, he actually wrote a book on Eros, where he tried to cleanse the mistaken notions that he feels existed in Western civilization regarding passion or sexual desire. And, that's not how you solve the problem. Christ died on the cross. That's why I have it in this video. That's beautiful crucifix. And that is the way to solve the problem of fallen human nature. It's not by trying to rehabilitate passion. It's about mortifying the flesh. And it requires in many cases doing physical restraint to yourself, but it requires even more than the acceptance of truth and the desire of the will to leave aside all pursuits but the adoration of God and the service of God. And that's the highest levels of mortification, which is called interior mortification in the classical manuals. And this is the lesson we all need to take from what has happened in the church in the last 30 years by the revelation of all these sins that were there and being hidden. A profound call to return to Calvary and stand with our Lord there on the cross, and to live for Him alone. God bless. Ave Maria.